Good morning, friends. A real thrill to have Liz Cheney here. Liz, I've enjoyed our conversation already, and I'm really anxious to talk more with you. I think we ought to start with the news of the day, if that's okay. Last night, the debt ceiling package passed the U.S. House, interestingly with the support of 165 Democrats and 149 Republicans. So just let me get your reaction to what we've watched play out, and whether we should have a debt ceiling at all if all we're ever going to do is vote to raise it.
Well, it is Washington. So, look, I think that it's hugely important that America not default. And, the voices in this debate that you've heard sort of saying, well, it wouldn't be that big a deal, don't know what they're talking about. So I am glad that they came to an agreement. There are pieces of the agreement that, Republicans like, pieces that Democrats like. I think it's good they came to the agreement. I will tell you the one piece of it that does give me real concern is the defense spending piece. And, we've seen this repeatedly where there's a sense of being able to handle the very real and serious debt crisis on the back of the Defense Department. And when you look at the challenges we're facing around the world today, we simply can't be in a position where we aren't keeping up with and, frankly, even surpassing the capabilities of our adversaries.
Not as damaging as maybe default, but don't we do damage by getting this close to default?
Yes, certainly. And I think this is one area where Congress is really broken. When you look at how many years we failed to get an actual appropriations package across the line, how many times we operated on a continuing resolution. I think that, the CAPS agreement that was in place in the 2010-2011 time period ended up being very damaging. And when you have a situation in that case where you just had arbitrary across-the-board cuts, when Congress couldn't come to agreement, arbitrary cuts, in particular, again, in the Defense Department, are really damaging. And Congress needs to do its job and make decisions about what we're going to spend on. When you look at how much of the budget is mandatory spending, even if you set aside programs like Social Security, Medicare, there's over $1 trillion annually that's mandatory, which means it just is going to continue to get appropriated with no action by Congress, that we ought to move on to the discretionary side. And again, I'm not talking about the entitlements programs, but I think that's a step we could take to say every year Congress, the House should authorize, should appropriate, the Senate should do the same, and we ought to actually, be doing our job as Congress.
Yeah. It was almost exactly 4 years ago that John Boehner sat on this very stage and said to me, there is no Republican Party now, there is only the party of Trump, and that Republicans were off taking a nap. Is that still true today?
I think probably even more true today. We were talking backstage about, I hope it's only a nap, but I think that when you look at where the party is, and especially what the party is willing to tolerate, what the party is willing to enable, it's very difficult to make the claim that it remains the party, that embraced sort of the substantive conservative principles of somebody like President Reagan. And I think it's a real concern, because the issues that we're talking about with respect to the debt, issues with respect to national security, issues with respect to other domestic policy, the nation really needs to have parties that can have a substantive debate about policy. And right now we have one party that has embraced insurrection, one party that is essentially trapped in a cult of personality, willingly trapped in a cult of personality, and that's a really dangerous place for us to be. So I don't think you can look at today's Republican Party and say that it is any kind of a healthy institution.
You famously fought against that cult of personality, and it cost you dearly. I'm really curious as to whether now you look back and you have, I'm assuming since you are working on a book right now called Oath of Honor, that you don't have any regrets. But were there But let me, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Any regrets about the way that, maybe at the way things transpired, but at the way that the choices that you made?
No, I don't have any regrets about the choices I made, except my choice to support Donald Trump. I regret that. But there was no moment after it became clear that Donald Trump was willing to go to war with the rule of law. There was no moment where there was another possible honorable choice. And so when I look back at sort of each step of the way, I did what I felt my duty compelled me to do.
I and a lot of people remember your opening remarks on the committee, on the hearings about January 6th. Donald Trump only recently referred to it as a beautiful day. So doubling down now on what happened on January 6th, rather than even trying to put it into the rearview mirror, how long are we, do you fear, going to live with the fight over what happened and the fight over the narrative of what it was that we watched?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple of things. First of all, what happened that day and the violent attack at the Capitol, the attempt to stop the counting of electoral votes, the attempt to use force to overturn the election, all of those things are fact. Those are beyond dispute. I think that what is really important is for us to recognize, not only was this the first time in our history that the President of the United States refused to guarantee the peaceful transfer of power, refused to send help when the attack was underway, but also what that means fundamentally, because I think that people sort of tend, we all do it, we all tend to say, well, our institutions have held throughout, so many years in this country, and to take for granted that the institutions will always hold. But I think we all have to do a better job, both at educating ourselves, but especially maybe at educating our kids. And what does that mean? What's it mean to say we're a nation of laws? And why do these institutions matter so much? And why do we take an oath to the Constitution as elected officials and appointed officials? And why did the founders want us to take that oath? Why did they understand that allegiance to the Constitution was the most important thing? I've been reading recently some of the opinions and speeches of Justice Scalia. And he, whether you agree with his jurisprudence or not, he makes a very important point that there are many countries around the world that have a Bill of Rights, that have, something that looks like our Bill of Rights. The former Soviet Union used to have a Bill of Rights. But it's not the Bill of Rights that guarantees our freedom. It's the structure of our government. It's the separation of powers, both between the branches at the federal level and also between the federal level and the state level. And that really, at the end of the day, matters. If you allow power to be centralized in one individual, then none of your freedoms will be protected. So, recognizing that you can't simply pledge allegiance to the Constitution and uphold your oath when doing so fulfills your political objective. You have to do it even, and I'd say especially when doing so hurts you politically. That's the true test.
This has all put you in a really interesting situation, I think, in American life.
That's one word for it.
That's, Here because of your stance against President Trump, the things that your role on the committee, we saw you here in Michigan campaigning for Alyssa Slotkin. I think a lot of people, a lot of Democrats must come up to you and feel like all of a sudden you're a kindred spirit. I'm not sure that you are disavowing any of your conservative bona fides, correct?
Listen, well, I think the most conservative of all conservative principles is allegiance to the Constitution, and I am a conservative. At one point when Donald Trump called me a rhino, I'll tell you guys it's a secret, so just don't tell anybody. I came up with what I thought was a great tweet, which was that I've been a conservative longer than Donald Trump has been spray tanning. Now, I will tell you that my communications director at the time told me, I could tell he was really nervous about this tweet. But he came up with a really good argument. He said, actually, technically, we don't know how long Donald Trump's been spray tanning. So I said, okay.
That was the problem?
Make the claim.
I'm going to, but as we move into this new election cycle, a lot of us, I think, are very curious about where you're going to be on this. I'm going to assume that since Ron DeSantis has talked about pardoning a lot of the January 6th insurgents, that he's probably not going to be where you're going to move your support.
That is true.
Okay. We have a lot of, Chris Christie said yesterday that he's going to be announcing soon. Mike Pence is going to be announcing. We've already seen a couple of other people who are already in the race, and I think there's a lot of people who would love to hear about Liz Cheney making a run for president. Is that any? It's just you and I here.
Yeah.
Just between you and me,
yeah,
is that
right,
a possibility?
I'm not making any announcements here today. I am really focused on making sure that Donald Trump isn't anywhere close to the Oval Office again. And I'm going to continue to make sure to do everything I can, both to ensure that, also to make sure that other election deniers are not elected. And I think that is just so hugely important. When we put people in positions of authority who deny the sanctity of our elections, we really do put the republic at risk. And so in offices around the country, I'm going to be working in that regard.
You are speaking, in a way, to the Michigan Republican Party, which had basically as a litmus test at its last convention that if you believed that Joe Biden was the properly elected president, you really weren't welcome here. And the party's being led by election deniers.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on what's going on in Michigan?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, Michigan is a hugely important state. And I say that with great fondness for Michigan. The very first campaign I ever worked on in my whole life was in 1976 for Jerry Ford. My dad was his chief of staff, and we were volunteers on the campaign. I tell people even now when I hear the Michigan Fight song, I think of Jerry Ford because they played it at every single campaign event. And,
There's a few people in this room who have it as their ringtone.
Yes,
so.
I can imagine. That's right. Don't tell anybody in Ohio I said that. But no, look, I think that what's happening here in Michigan, I mean, I see it in my home state of Wyoming as well. The chairman of the party in Wyoming is a member of the Oath Keepers. And we as Republicans have to reject that. And what I have seen happen is that people who are willing to deny elections and people who are embracing this cult of personality around Donald Trump are not only running for, state in federal office, but they are also running, for school board office. They're running to be precinct chairmen and women,
yes.
and they have to be resisted at every stage of that battle and of that effort. And I would say something to my Democratic friends. When you have somebody like Peter Meyer, who did a very courageous thing. Peter had been in Congress for like 3 days.
A couple days.
Maybe 10 days by the time we had the impeachment vote. And he did what he knew was right. And then we had the National Democratic Party come in and support his opponent, who was an election denier, in the primary. And that's playing with fire. If there are Democrats who think, well, if we just get Trump as the Republican nominee, we can defeat him in the general, I would say that is not a risk any of us can take. So don't play that kind of game. And I think that the fundamental test, and look, it was why I came to do an event for Alyssa Slotkin. Being at a Democratic political rally in Lansing, Michigan is not something I ever imagined myself doing. But Alyssa, she, along with Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, these are people, colleagues of mine, that I know are good people. And I think that in this election cycle, and hopefully it won't take us too many more, but the political ground is really shifting, and we all have to support people we know will defend the Constitution, and people who will do what's right.
Every 4 years, somebody says, the time really is finally right for a third-party candidate. It just, the time is always right. But I didn't even know Fred Upton was here today. There are a number of people, Fred Upton among them, there are a number of people who really do believe that we have so many people now. In fact, we are now headed, it appears, to an election that nobody seems to want. Mm-hmm. The polls show us that nobody wants Biden-Trump 2. And yet, out of a country of 350 million people or so, these are the only two people we can seem to find to run. But I'm curious as to whether... you see real life, in a third, for a number of reasons, it never really works. You end up being a spoiler more than a contender. But do you see a room this time around then for a third-party candidate?
I think that this is a moment where, as I mentioned a moment ago, the tectonic plates of our politics are shifting. And they're shifting because the peril is so real. I don't know whether that means, we'll have a third-party candidate. I think it could. And, certainly one of my mentors is Fred Upton, and I wouldn't want to challenge, what Fred thinks politically, especially here in Michigan. But I do think, if you think about, and a number of my colleagues who voted to impeach the president, President Trump, and I have this discussion, in every area of our lives, we really try to demand excellence. But then you look at our politics, and we don't demand excellence. Now, if you think about, especially today, the threats that we face as a country, are like up here. And we were talking backstage about national security threats, what's happening in AI, the economy. The threats and the challenges and the complexity are up here. And too often, the caliber of the people we're electing is down here. And so you cannot expect to successfully navigate your way through those challenges and prevail and defend the country if we keep electing people who, are not up to that task, who aren't serious. We need people who are serious. We need people who are sane. Mm-hmm. I think that's really key.
I can't believe that you have to say that.
I know.
But
And so I think that one of the things, and certainly one of the most important things that means is everybody has to be engaged and involved. And that doesn't just mean make sure you vote for the best candidate. It means put your name on the ballot and run for office yourselves. Because if you go in to vote, when you go into the polling place, if there's no good choice, then we aren't going to get excellence. But we cannot leave our politics to those people who don't believe in elections. We can't leave our politics to those people who are willing to unravel the Constitution in order to achieve their political goal. But that means every single person has to contemplate running for office, and certainly you've got to support good candidates.
Yeah. And because I can't leave it alone, would a third party be a place where you could see you maybe arriving?
I may... Look, I think that we have to have good people, and I don't know yet what that is going to look like. We have a lot of good people, that some of whom you've mentioned, who are talking about getting in on the Republican side. We have across the board good candidates. We'll see what happens, but I'm not going to rule it out.
Okay. She hears you, Fred. We got it. I want to go back to lying, and I know this is, as a journalist, maybe more my own bailiwick than others, but the town hall that CNN aired with former President Trump recently has been, CNN has been dragged every which way. I thought Caitlin Collins did an amazing job of trying to fact check in real time, and yet it is what it is. I have come to believe, as a journalist, we're all taught that there's two sides to every story. Well, I've had to come to realize that a lie is not a side.
Yeah.
I don't owe a lie equal time.
Right.
But I'm really curious from your standpoint, as we move into another election cycle where lies are not only being retold, but doubled down on, how would you recommend that, CNN was trying to, if Donald Trump is going to be the nominee, he probably deserves a platform somewhere, and yet look where it ended up as a bit of a dumpster fire. How do we move forward and try to cover and help voters be better prepared on how to use their cherished vote?
Yeah, I think that the role of the media is hugely important. And, all you have to do is look at Fox News and the fact that they now have to pay $787 million to Dominion. Yep. And, you understand the danger of lies. And one of my favorite historians is a British historian named Andrew Roberts, and he, I saw recently, he said, one of the most important lessons of history is that people very rarely learn the lessons of history. And I think that where we are now and what we've seen happen, particularly among the House Republicans, is, people say to themselves, well, just this one more time, just this one more time. People were saying, well, I know it's not really constitutional to object to electoral votes, but, I'm just going to do this one thing so that I don't get targeted. And we've seen the danger of that, just one more thing. So I think that it is also crucially important because you've got a combination of people who really believe the lie and really good people who really believe the lie, who've been betrayed. And if those of us who know it's a lie, and those of us who have pledged, we're going to live in the truth here, if we don't speak out, then those people who believe the lie have no counter to it. And And, I've had people say to me things like, gosh, if it's as dangerous as you're saying, why aren't there more Republicans saying it's dangerous? Why aren't they speaking out? So we have to demand that of our elected officials, and we got to demand it of our media.
If we define a lie as someone saying something they know to be untrue, I'm really curious as to how you think the breakdown is among President Trump's supporters at the Capitol. How many of them are lying, and how many of them believe what they're saying?
Look, the number of members of Congress who really believe that the 2020 election was stolen is smaller than the membership of the Freedom Caucus. I mean, it's small. Now, I think with the others, it's a combination of, they'll say, look, I'm not claiming the election's stolen, but I'm going to support Donald Trump if he runs again. They'll say that. And I think the question has to be, how in the world can you contemplate giving someone the awesome power of the presidency when he has demonstrated that he is willing to be completely unfaithful to the Constitution? The January 6th committee made criminal referrals for the activity that he engaged in. And if he's not held accountable, I mean, he certainly should not be anywhere engaged in our politics or political life again. But if he's not held accountable for what he did, then what he did becomes acceptable. And we will see it again and again and again.
Last question on him. But we've seen his support only seems to strengthen when, say, he's found responsible for a sexual assault and defamation of E. Jean Carroll. I will be shocked if Georgia doesn't return I think a lot of people will be shocked if Georgia doesn't return some kind of indictment over the January 6th and him trying to talk them into moving votes around. We've got the classified documents. But is there anything that you see out there or is it really shooting someone in Fifth Avenue and he doesn't lose any support? Is there anything that knocks him off of the pedestal that so many have put him on?
Well, let me answer it this way. Those of us who are in political life today have an obligation to defend the Constitution. We have an obligation to do everything we can to make sure that people who are unwilling to fulfill their oath aren't elected. We have an obligation to make sure that we're a nation of laws. And so the decisions about, what the political impact might be on accountability in the criminal justice system, those things should be completely separated. Because the question here is whether or not Donald Trump committed high crimes and misdemeanors initially, as I clearly believe he did, and I think he should have been convicted in the Senate. And now the question is about criminal culpability, and as I said, the Select Committee made criminal referrals. They're detailed criminal referrals. You can read them in our Select Committee report. And politics can't play any part of determinations about prosecution. But there's no question that Donald Trump was engaged in a whole range of behavior that he knew to be unlawful based upon claims he knew to be untrue.
Yeah. Speaking of politics and the judiciary, how concerned are you about the ethics right now surrounding the Supreme Court?
I think that it's crucially important that we have confidence in in all of our institutions, but certainly in our judicial system. The court puts in place its own ethics requirements. The Supreme Court does. I know that I've read that they made some adjustments to that within the last year, and I have confidence in their ability to understand and recognize how important their credibility is and respond accordingly. I read sorry, I just want to say something because you mentioned the Supreme Court. Yeah. When I was in law school at the University of Chicago, one of my professors was Elena Kagan, and she was one of my favorite professors because she kept politics out of the classroom. But I just happened to be reading something that she wrote about Justice Scalia. And I commend it to everybody because it's a foreword to a book about Justice Scalia's writings. But Justice Kagan talked about how when she was on the court with Justice Scalia for about 6 years, every time a draft opinion that he had written came around, she stopped everything she was doing to read it. And she knew, even when she disagreed, maybe especially when she disagreed with what he was saying, that she would learn from it. And it struck me as such an important lesson of we need to listen to people, especially people who are that engaged and smart on the other side of an issue, and we need to be willing to learn from them. Yeah. And that, she says it made her a better justice, yeah. And that give and take of ideas, it matters so much.
Which speaks to, yeah. Speaks to the power of "and," which is, of course, the theme of one of the themes of the conference. I want to talk to you about national security. You rattled off earlier in our conversation 3 things, and I'm really curious. Of China, Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, and artificial intelligence, which one worries you the most?
Well, what worries me is the intersection of all of them. And I mean, and this is where the United States doesn't take any action that doesn't have multiple people watching. So, if we were going to make the decision, for example, that we weren't going to support Ukraine, that would be wrong morally. It would be wrong from a security perspective, and it would send the message to China. America is not supporting its ally. It makes it more likely that China takes action against Taiwan. China wants to run the world. They think that it's a zero-sum game. They think they have to defeat us to do it. And people ought to really think about what would it be like to live in a global surveillance state. And that's where we will be if China is allowed to take the steps and the actions it wants to take to control the world. And then, AI is something that can be a tremendous tool, but it's also something that is very concerning and that people need to deal with and recognize that there have to be controls. And, we were talking about the situation where an attorney filed a brief last week that he had to admit the research had been done using ChatGPT, and 7 or 8 of the cases cited in this brief do not exist. They don't exist. Now, the thing that is very troubling, there are many troubling things about that, but if you think about it, ChatGPT, or whichever AI platform he used, made the decision to lie, right? The brief required cases to support the proposition that the attorney was arguing for, and when those cases could not be found, when those cases did not exist, the AI made them up. Didn't just make up the names of the cases, but summarized what those cases stand for. Now, how does that work? You've got an AI that's making a decision to lie. And I think that's just the latest example of what can be a tremendously powerful and revolutionary, important tool, but has very grave danger if we don't treat it appropriately.
To China, lastly, in particular, China wants to rule the world, and yet I can't imagine us doing a collection here, an inventory of everything in this room that was made in China. And getting things to Mackinac Island isn't easy anyway. And yet, so we have this weird symbiosis between we need each other, we don't trust each other. How do we move forward, especially in Michigan, where this is really acute, as we're trying to help electrify the mobility industry?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the situation we find ourselves in is one where, for 20 years now, China has viewed itself as, in many ways, at war with the United States through a variety of means, and we missed it. We both, I would say, going back probably longer than 20 years, going back to the Clinton administration, in the Bush administration, the Obama administration. We sort of took the view, listen, if we help China engage with the world economically, then they will be compelled also to open up politically. And that's not what happened. We opened doors. The Chinese Communist Party determined to engage economically and have taken advantage of, and we certainly saw it during COVID, when we recognized not only the responsibility for the spread of COVID globally, but also the extent to which all of our crucial, supply chains for antibiotics and other medications, are controlled by China, and so it's a huge threat and challenge. One of the good bipartisan things that's happening in the House of Representatives today is the China Committee that's got Republican chairman, Democratic ranking member working in a bipartisan way on this issue. But I think we really do have to be realistic and understand that, at the end of the day, the Chinese Communist Party is not doing what it's doing out of, altruism, but carries with it very real risks that, we'll lose the ability to help defend ourselves and our allies.
Ms. Cheney, I think the admiration that this room feels for you and the positions you've taken have been clear. I'm so grateful you were here.
It's my
Liz
pleasure.
Cheney.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.